Now that the drawing is completed, I'm going to pull up the layers a little bit more so I can see them. I can see that the layers have all been named. I have L's and R's in front of the layers so I can keep track of what's there. They are not drawn or created in any great particular order. I can turn off the layers to see what's happening so we can see the different layers as they're occurring. The legs are on top of each other. The legs are not copied, so I just didn't duplicate them. It is important that you name your layers adequately when you're working, because on any of the programs and any of the tools that we're working, if you keep your workspace organized, and naming layers is a great thing that you can do, it just makes your life a gazillion times easier. So I really, really do stress you should keep your layers named. And we'll worry about the order of them, because right now I can drag things up or down and I can move them around, and it really doesn't matter. And now we'll also notice that they're starting to connect to each other in some rather weird ways. So I have the leg connected to the foot, connected to the hips. Yeah, this is, that's going to be a mess, but it's really easy to fix not in the timeline. And this is one of the things that is nice about Animate Pro, is that I don't have to do everything in the timeline, but I have what is called our network view that we'll take a look at shortly, that is infinitely more powerful. So we'll be working with that. But before we switch to the network view, what we really need to do is we need to go through and set the pivot point for each one of our drawing layers, because after we have set the drawing layers pivot points, then we can control how they're going to animate. Otherwise, if I use the animation tool and click on my objects, so though these are set, we're going to see how you would go about resetting your pivot points. Now, it's a good idea when you're setting pivot points and working with it, when we're not animating yet, we turn off animation. So the little yellow running man there, when that is highlighted, so it has the dark background, that means it's going to add keyframes anytime I move objects. So if I take this leg and move it, we'll see it put a black dot here, indicating that, wrong, it's about here, but indicating that it is a keyframe. So if I zoom way in, I can see it now indicates, yes, there's a keyframe here. So I don't want that. So let's clear that keyframe, delete keyframe right there, so it's gone. Now, what I'm going to do is make sure animation is turned off for now. Then I'm going to go up to the top of my window here, and I will choose drawing. This will now give me access to just this drawing, where on this drawing, remembering that if we look in library where we can have different drawings associated with different body parts, and apparently there are different ones on this particular piece. But if I go into this lower leg, if I want to set the pivot point, I choose the pivot point tool, and then I click where I want that pivot point to be. The pivot point determines where that item is going to transform from. Is it going to rotate from the bottom of the leg, from the top of the leg? So I can now use H and J to cycle through my drawing layers. Notice in the timeline I can see how it's moving, and I can see each of the pivot points. If I don't like a pivot point, I can certainly move it. So if I want the hips to rotate from the bottom of the hips, I could move the hip down there. I could adjust the thigh so it rotates in the middle of the thigh, the top of the thigh, lower leg, foot. So these are all the point at which these objects will pivot. And I'm using H and J to cycle through each of the layers, and then clicking with the pivot point tool. So if the pivot point is out here for that leg, then in my camera view, if I choose to move that with an animation tool, we will see that under rotate, it's rotating around that pivot point. So that's probably not a good way to rotate the calf in relation to the foot or the thigh if it's rotating from a point way outside the body. the process of establishing your pivot points and establishing that at the beginning is really critical. It's really, really critical to establish all of those pivot points on your drawing layers before you start animating. Because if you change the pivot point after you begin animating, all of your previous animation will be adjusted. So people have found that they've had hundreds of frames of animation ruined because they decided at frame 500 to tweak a pivot point. And then all those 500 frames are suddenly wonked. So it's really, 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 really important to do the pivot point first. The next activity that we're going to do is try and organize our network view. Our network view is where we really are able to do some amazing things and have a lot more control over our project. So the network view is down here, and if I'm going to add another version of the network view up here so it can be a little bit bigger for everyone to see. So here's my network view, and what the network view shows me is this is what it's going to write out. So if I look at this, I can see currently my project is set to create a series of images of the TGA file type, but I could certainly choose like PNG4 or JPEG or TIFF or whatever format makes me happy. If you see a 4 under the file types, that indicates a fourth color channel being transparency. So a PNG would be RGB, a PNG4 would be RGBA. So it would have transparency around your artwork. So if you want to animate something in here and export it out and bring it into something, so make a transparent web banner ad or something like that, you would choose, you could choose like PNG4, and then it would export a series of background transparent PNG graphics that then you could then sequence in whatever tool you wanted for building that animated annoying time loop, whether you animate with JavaScript or make a GIF or whatever. So the write module is what is going to export. Now when I look at this, I'll see that there's all kinds of pieces here, and we'll notice the names on these correspond to the names of our layers. And in the beginning, this whole thing gets a little bit visually complex and overwhelming, and sometimes leaves us going, whoa, what have I got myself into? But once you start to understand it, you realize
it's worse.
Every program should have this because it allows you to organize things so much faster and easier and better, and with much, 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 much more control. So the composite is where all of your layers come together, and then it either outputs to a file or it outputs to the current screen. The current screen is the display. So if you take this display and you turn it off or disable it, now if I go back to my camera view and look at the, it should have, okay, or not. Should have killed it, but it didn't. Oh well. So we'll leave display on. So display though is how we see. We need that. Composite is where it comes together, and here's all my layers. Now it looks like chaos. All these cords connecting things are referred to as pipes. So the program calls those pipes. So we're connecting things with pipes. Now I can manually drag things around and organize them. And if you're an organizational freak where everything has to be in a perfect order, you're like, okay, I want to create now a nice, perfect, whoop, no, this one has to be over here. Oh, shoot, this one over here. You're like, wow, this is a huge pain. And you should be thinking to yourself, gee, wouldn't it be nice if there's a tool that could automatically do that for me?
Yeah.
There is. So what we end up having to do is in the original network view, we can pull up a toolbar for it. And we access that by choosing Window, Toolbars, Network View. So when I do that, my network view comes up and I get this series of buttons here.
Do it.
So step 4, the first thing we have to do is click on Display. And then once you click on Display, in your network toolbar, you click on Order Up, and then you can leave the default, hit OK, and suddenly you get this beautiful nice organized view to your layers, and it's just wonderful. And we can see where we have the legs and the foot, and oh wait, both legs are in front of the hips. That might not work, but that's easy to adjust here because I can now move my layers around if I decide I don't like the order of the layers. And I'm going to adjust the ordering of my layers here and leave the camera up so we can see. If I wanted to move my hips over, so I know the hips are this module right there, all I have to do is drag it on my composite and it reorders the pipes, and we can now see the hips just landed on top. So now both legs are beneath the hips. I can put the hips in the middle between the legs. If I want the, let's see, which is which. If I turn those layers off so we can see now here I have a foot. So I can now take its pipe and I can put it so it goes behind the leg, it goes on top of the leg. So you can reorder by moving those connection points. So in the network, you're moving these different connection points. What is on left is on top. What is on the right is on the bottom. So that is your layer stack. If I look at my layer stack and move the hips, I will see my layer stack just moved as well. So if you think in terms of other programs where I move layers up and I move layers down by grabbing the layer itself, what ends up happening often in Animate Pro is that we do the layer ordering in the network view instead of doing it in the timeline. Because as we get more complex, it's going to become that much more important to worry about the network view and less about how the timeline's ordered. We worry about the network and what we see versus what we see in the timeline. We start moving a little bit away from the timeline, and that gives us more control and more flexibility. So I can put the hips on top, put the hips in the middle. It's all good. I can turn layers, enable layers to turn them back on, or click the check mark in the timeline. So we can do a mix of both. The next step that we're going to do is to add in our pegs that we will use for controlling our animation. So what we do is we highlight the layers that we wish to attach pegs to. So with the layers highlighted, so I don't select composite, write, or display, but I'm highlighting my drawing layers here. Then what we can do in the network view is hit Command-Shift-P, or if you're on Windows, Control-Shift-P. And then that adds in pegs. Now, it's also possible you can highlight your layers in the timeline, and then there's the Add Peg option there. And if I click that, that adds in a series of pegs as well. Now we'll notice that our network view got severely hosed doing it in the timeline view compared to the network view, but again, we can use our organizational tool of click display, click order up, and now it reorganizes so we have all of our pegs nicely connected. Once you have the pegs attached to each layer, now what we're able to do is we're able to attach the pegs kind of to each other to gain some control, because I want when I move the upper leg, I want it to also be moving the lower leg. And then when I move the lower leg, I want it to move the foot. So I am now connecting my upper leg to my lower leg to my foot, and then I'm also going to connect from the hips. I will connect to each upper leg. So what that means, and we can organize this, I can always hit display, order up, and get it nicely organized. But what this means is if I move the hips, it will now move the legs and the hips. If I move the upper leg, the lower leg and foot are attached to it, so they go along for the ride. But if I move the foot, it doesn't affect the rest of the body because the foot is at the end of the chain. So before we can animate, we have to modify the registration points for these peg layers, because if I look at the drawing layer, we can see its registration point is correct. It's at the top of the thigh. But if I look at the registration point for the peg layer, it's back to the middle of the screen. If I go to the lower leg, it's, well, that's almost in the middle of the screen. The hips, it's showing me the registration point is all the way in the middle of the screen, but the hips themselves are supposed to be registering at that point. So we got some issues here to deal with. So when I have an animation tool selected, in my tool properties, I need to say peg selection mode, not the standard marquee tool, but I want peg selection. So if I click on something, it chooses the peg. It never selects artwork. So if I click here, I chose a peg layer. Just extend this out a little bit so we can read. So it chose the peg layer, not the drawing layer. And we can see in the layer palette, peg layers have the little kind of S. It almost looks like a Bezier curve with two handles on it, versus the triangle, circle, square of a drawing layer. So that's how they're a little bit different. But we can see that the foot peg is registering all the way up at the middle. So if I go to rotate the foot, yeah, it's not working real well. So we're going to have to fix that. So I need to modify the registration point for the foot. And there's two ways we can do it. One is we can select each layer and we can reset the registration point for the peg manually by, we can transfer the information from the drawing layer to the peg layer. So that is an option we can do. And in this case where I only have 7 layers, that's not a huge endeavor. That's not going to like break the bank and be like, oh my gosh, that's so much work. So I'm going to show you where you can do that. So in case you're just doing one layer, the easy way to do that. So if I go to my upper thigh here, well actually we'll do the foot because the foot's peg is showing so far off. So if I go into the foot and double click on the foot layer, it pulls up my layer properties. Inside the layer properties, I can click on drawing, and we're now able to use the apply embedded pivot on drawing layer. So we can see, we can apply how we want to apply our transformation point for the pivots. So double click on a layer. So if I select a layer, we look at the pivot point, we'll choose one that's not being affected. So the hips, we want the hips to pivot based on that point up there. But if I look at this upper leg, if I look at the lower leg here, that we can see that the pegs, like on the thigh, aren't lining up. So we go into the layer properties, double click on the layer, change under the drawing tab. It defaults to transformation, go to drawing. Those of you who want to look ahead, notice if you enable 3D, you can start doing 3D transformations in your drawing for those who want a little extra fun in the beginning. Just throwing that out there. Apply embedded pivot on parent peg. The default is on drawing layer, but we choose on parent peg. And now the peg layer inherits the pivot point information from the drawing layer. So we can now see that it's connected to it. So if I rotate that leg, we can see that the whole leg is now moving from that hip joint, which is pretty cool. So it now moved that whole leg. But if I go to the lower leg, we can see it's not lining up. It's low. It's showing up way too high, so we can see that, yeah, we have a broken knee. So we're going to have to fix that one. So with 7 layers, it's not a big deal to individually go through each layer and change that pivot point information. If you have more than that, then what you might want to do is to select multiple layers. And an easy way to do that is, of course, in your network, you can just select it, So I've selected all of my layers. And we have an option under Window, Toolbars, Scripting. So this is now another toolbar where we can get more buttons. By default, that's not there. So a lot of the buttons that we see on screen aren't necessarily all there, and we can turn them on or off. Noticing under toolbars, the ones that are on, we can certainly turn them off while I'm working. So if I don't want to see the playback tools, I turn those off. No, I kind of want those, so I'll turn them back on. If I don't want deformation or editor, so we have all these options that if we don't need them, we can turn them off if we find that they're distracting or too much information. But under scripting, there's a really cool script that they wrote on it where I'm able to set properties on many layers. So if I want to change the properties to a whole bunch of layers in one click, I can do that. So I click here, and now I can choose these common things. So sometimes we may do some complex things with our artwork as we're working using line art and overlay art and color lay and underlay. So we have every drawing layer actually has 4 layers of its artwork. So you could think of it as you have a line art layer, then you could paint the colors that would go behind it. So it'd be like traditional cell animation where you do the outlines on one side of the cell, flip it over and paint on the back, and then it looks like you were magically able to paint inside the lines. So traditional hand painted animation. So we have these different artwork layers, and we can use them to our advantage when we do some complex animated techniques as well, which we may get to some of those later on in the semester. So once we do that, highlight the layers, then we can use our same option here, use embedded pivot point, and now I always forget which one I want to choose here, and chose parent peg. So now back under camera, I can escape. Now if I click on the thigh here, the thigh, I should be selecting its parent or its peg. Chose the upper leg peg. We can see now it's rotating from there, and now I can move down, up and down my line. So now I've chosen the lower leg, it moves correctly there. And if I start out at the foot, foot's rotating, I can point his foot like a dancer. I can hit B, move up the food chain. I can break the leg and bend it backwards, or I can pull it behind. I can hit B again, move there. And now I can hit B again. Now that brought me all the way up. I'm choosing the hips peg. And now I could move the whole, whoa, get a little spin happy there. Hit escape, nothing selected. I can now click on a different leg. I'll select this leg here, put that underneath. Click on the foot. Rotate the foot around. So now we have a dancer flying across the screen. So it's quite easy to work on controlling and positioning the object. It does work best moving up and down the food chain or the body chain, the hierarchy chain, the rigging. If you start at the end, so I click on the foot, if I hit B, it goes up one, hit B again, it goes up to the next, hit B again, goes up again. If I hold down Shift and hit B, it works my way back down the chain. If I start at the hips, B has nowhere to go, Shift B, it sometimes will figure out the best way to go. But now on this leg, I hit the thigh, and now I'm going down, and it went from lower leg and then foot. It's not choosing the foot, so it's getting a little bit confused there. So if I start at the foot, it's able to work its way down. So if you start with the end, the extremity, the hand or the foot on a rigging chain, you're able to manipulate it. To bring in the drawing guide, import images, and then I browse for the file in the project folder, or there's a file that exists there, arm poses RW JPEG. You can bring in JPEGs, you can bring in PNGs, you can bring in PSDs, you cannot bring in GIFs. So Just know, otherwise the default setting should be fine. Hit OK, brings in that layer. So now here's my legs, here is the artwork. They don't quite line up in terms of position or size, so we need to do some adjustments. The easiest way to really adjust this artwork layer would be to add a peg layer to it as well, because once I've added the peg to that layer, I can now scale it or transform it so that I can make it bigger or smaller as I see fit, so that I can adjust its size so that the legs, and if I hold shift, it keeps it the same. So I can now try to line up the size. So I can look and determine if I'm getting pretty close size-wise for it, and it looks like that's going to be about the right size for what I need. Now I can decide, do I want to start my character walking on one side of the screen and then follow these poses as I work my way across the screen, or do I want to walk my character in place and then at the end animate its master peg across? So using what we did last week where we have a peg that we're now animating across the screen versus hand drawing each thing, both of these are viable options. So today I'm going to work with starting the character so it's just on screen. It'll be the leg right there. So this now is the position I want to start my drawing in, where the drawing is near the edge, and then I will move my legs over to that to begin the animation process. After getting the artwork in and getting my tracing template positioned using and scaled using a peg layer, I'm going to collapse its layer as well so I just see the peg, and I am going to lock it so I don't accidentally select it. Well, notice that turns the layer name red, so if I try to select it, nothing happens. So I don't have to worry about accidentally hosing it up. So in my book, that's a good thing. Now what I want to do is I want to move the legs over. So I want to get my legs ready to their starting frame, their starting position. Then I'm going to turn on my animation and show you how we're going to move it. So I'm going to move the legs over to a starting position. So I drag them over. I'm using the transform tool here. And then I can now take each leg and modify the body parts as I see fit to line up with these respective poses. So we just, one thing to do, when you're using the transform tool, if you grab the artwork, it moves it and that kind of breaks it, not good. So ideally, once you have it positioned, what we want to do is to then either make sure you're only grabbing in the corner and rotating, but if you fail to do that, you can always just switch to the rotate only tool, which is up here. Then that will prevent you from moving the artwork around, so that can be a good thing. So now I have my starting position for my animation. So at this point, what we need to do is extend our animation out. So I am going to extend my animation out to the end by clicking at the end of my timeline and then hitting F6 on the keyboard. F6, I'm sorry, not F6, F5 extends it out. And I'm going to do the same thing with my layer of the artwork. So I click at the end frame and hit F5, and then that extends it out. Now if I uncollapse the layer, I will notice how the frames extend out. We can see the exposure for those layers is now extending out. But it's important when you're animating to really close the layer, because as we're adding keyframes, it will be much more controllable if we only do it by seeing our master or our main control peg. That will be better. If we need to select a specific peg, we can always click on it in the network view, and we can see how that allows us to choose that particular peg. Sometimes that can be a useful way of working, is just having your network view open as well to select those layers. So now that I've extended it out, so we can see my animation extends for 60 frames. In frame 1 for my character, I am going to click at frame 1 and I will hit F6 now, and we can see how that put in a starting keyframe. Now, doing that gives me a starting keyframe that if I extend out, that we'll notice that it's giving me keyframe information for X, Y, Z, skew, scale, velocity, and my path position. Or you can collapse it so you don't get scared. But the reason we hit F6 is in doing so, it made sure everything was keyframed. Otherwise, if I just rotate something on this keyframe, and then at the next keyframe move and rotate something, sometimes we get some weird behaviors. So when we're doing major kind of moving the whole character, it usually works best to go to the next primary keyframe, hit F6 so that we know position and rotation and everything else is all being applied, so we don't get weird surprises where, okay, so I wanted this one to rotate from here to here at this point, but now it thinks I wanted to be rotating all the way from frame 1 instead of frame 10 to 20. So it gives us some weird stuff if we don't click at the next major keyframe. I will hit F6. The black line indicates it's going to tween it. And now at this point, I am going to grab the transform tool so I can both move, and we can see the hips as the legs bend. Notice the hips are going down. As the leg extends, they'll go up, and then it goes up higher, and then it comes back down. So the walk cycle follows this kind of curving S movement to it. Now, if you're having a hard time kind of picturing what a movement should be or how a movement is going, the best thing you can do when you're animating is to do it. So if you're trying to animate a face, make faces in a mirror. If you're animating a walk or a jump or a fall, go through the motion yourself to start to feel internally what's going on, and then it's much easier to translate that into the movement. So now that I move the hips to their position, I need to now bend the legs to line up with what I see in my animation guide. So we can see that they didn't line up before. I can even turn on onion skinning and I can extend things out, and that will start to give me some help as well. And with that, I'm going to switch to my rotation tool and start animating this leg. So I know I need this one to come up, and I can now start working my way through the food chain of it and move this leg back, bend it more at the knee, bend a little more in the foot. So I can see that I don't quite have enough room as I'm trying to maintain some semblance to the ground. So I will want to probably pull the hips up a little bit more. But now if I watch the animation occur, so I forgot to turn on the animation button, so let's undo a whole bunch of times until the legs go back to the beginning. So now I have the initial frame here. Turn on animate so it will automatically keyframe. Now I can click at this point here, hit F6, move the legs over down a little bit, and now if I animate, I can rotate. Whoa, not skew. Don't want to skew. I'll switch to rotate. Pull the leg up. Pull the lower leg down. And now we can see that it actually is lining up reasonably well for what I want here. And now if I... He's dragging, so we probably are going to need to pull the front leg up higher as he goes through the step. Oh, the back leg is dragging. I need to bend that more into it. And then extend the other leg out a little more.
Ooh.
So if the first movement moving to the next frame is simply going to be clicking the timeline, hit F6, and then so now I can go grab more body parts and stretch as I see fit. So we can see how the character is going to be. Now, if we're covering too much ground too quickly with it, what we can also do is take these primary positions, and I can certainly pull this back to here, knowing that the foot touched and then it went down. So I can see how maybe I don't want to cover quite so much distance, and now leaves a trail like the Flash, or we can see that we need to pull that back. So again, so it's not covering the distance, and now we can, oh, I got a little hiccup in the leg.
He's got a wicked knee.
He's got a bad knee there, but it's the foot from here.
I would totally leave it and not worry about it at all.
Now the thing to remember on it of do we want to work with this is to know at full speed it's going to go reasonably quick. So now the next position, if I want to work with it, I can hit F6 and now move over to here. I'm going to turn off onion skin so I can actually see again, and then pull the body parts back to line up, so I can now pull that thigh to there, pull this thigh forward so we can see what now that we really don't want to be covering that much distance, so this is where I can turn onion skinning back on and now move.
Because his right foot wouldn't move like that at all.
Right, he wouldn't be sliding. Now if we want to moonwalk, we could of course start pulling him backward, but otherwise we realize looking in the onion skinning it's going to be about there. So he's starting to walk forward. So we're paying attention to, I'm really watching that front foot and seeing where that right foot, where is it landing as he walks forward. And now I can move again to the next frame, turn off keyframing, or I mean turn off onion skinning, leave on animated and keyframing, no more rookie mistakes allowed for me tonight. Hit F6, and now as I move to that next frame, we can see that now it's ready to animate and move the leg, and move the leg, pull that there, and now take this leg and it'll bend there, stretch it out, rotate the foot to there. That's probably too much. I don't want to break his ankle as it pulls up. And once again, turn on onion skinning so we can see. Go back to my translate or to my animate tool, pull it back. And we're following then that front foot to see where it lands, and we'll see that now he has completed, he's done a whole step. Now the next part in the sequence would be to continue this, where then what is the back leg is now following the animation sequence of the front leg, and we can just keep working this across the screen, and now we have something walking and moving.